The moment the word criminal was directed from the highest office in Tehran toward the sitting president of the United States, the traditional rules of global diplomacy were not just broken, they were incinerated. This is no longer a standard dispute over nuclear protocols or economic sanctions. We have entered a darker, more volatile chapter of history, a direct, public confrontation between two powers where the only perceived resolution is the total collapse of the other. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has bypassed all diplomatic channels to issue a branding that transcends politics, labeling the American leadership as a criminal entity. In the hyper-calcified world of Middle Eastern geopolitics, this is more than an insult. It is a theological and legal declaration that closes the door on negotiation and opens the door to something far more terminal. Across the Atlantic, the response was not one of de-escalation, but of total structural defiance. The call for an end to a 40-year reign is a statement that echoes through the corridors of power in every capital from Moscow to Beijing. It signals a shift in Washington's doctrine from containment to something far more aggressive, the explicit endorsement of a systemic reset. When a global superpower publicly demands the dissolution of a regime that has stood for 4 decades, the machinery of war and intelligence begins to turn in ways that cannot be easily reversed. The stakes have moved beyond the regional. They are now existential. Every move made by either side from this point forward is calculated with one goal in mind: the survival of their own system and the absolute neutralization of the opponent. The catalyst for this sudden fracture is the internal state of Iran itself. The streets of Tehran and its surrounding provinces have become a laboratory of civil unrest, a pressure cooker that has finally reached its breaking point. Khamenei's decision to blame the United States for the thousands of deaths occurring within his borders is a strategic pivot. By framing the protesters not as citizens with grievances, but as agents of a foreign criminal power, the Iranian leadership is attempting to transform a domestic crisis into a nationalistic defense. It is a desperate gamble to consolidate power. However, this narrative carries a heavy price. To label the President of the United States as a criminal for supporting these movements is to invite a level of scrutiny and retaliation that the global financial and military systems are already beginning to process. The weight of 40 years is now pressing down on the current moment. Since the revolution of 1979, the Islamic Republic has built a fortress of ideological and military influence that spans the entire Levant. For 4 decades, this power structure has weathered sanctions, internal coups, and regional wars. But for the first time in nearly half a century, that fortress is showing deep structural cracks. The American call for an end to this reign is not just a tweet or a press release. It is a signal to the internal and external enemies of the Iranian state that the window of opportunity is open. It is an invitation to chaos. When the leader of the world's largest military force suggests that a long-standing government's time has run out, it creates a vacuum of authority that rivals and allies alike are rushing to fill. In the shadows of this public vitriol, the intelligence communities of the world are seeing a different picture. They see a map where the lines of communication have gone silent. Usually, even in the height of tension, there are back channels, neutral third parties in Switzerland or Oman that keep the world from the edge of the abyss. But those channels are now cold. When the rhetoric reaches the level of criminal and end of reign, there is no middle ground left for the diplomats to occupy. The situation is being treated by global analysts as a zero-sum game. If one side wins, the other must, by definition, cease to exist in its current form. This is the most dangerous configuration in international relations, as it leaves no room for a face-saving exit for either leader. The human cost of this rhetorical war is already being measured in the thousands. The mention of deaths within the Iranian borders is a grim reminder that this is not a game of words for those on the ground. For the supreme leader, these casualties are a tool of blame, a way to point the finger at Washington to deflect from internal systemic failures. For Washington, these same casualties are the moral justification for a policy of regime change. Both sides are using the same tragedy to build a case for an escalation that could lead to a broader regional conflagration. The world is watching a slow-motion collision where the victims are already being counted before the main impact has even occurred. This is a moment of profound historical gravity. We are witnessing the final breakdown of a status quo that has defined the Middle East for 2 generations. The 40-year reign, mentioned by the American leadership, is a reference to a specific era of history that many in the West believe is overstaying its welcome. But for the leadership in Tehran, that same 40-year period is a sacred legacy of resistance. When these two interpretations of history collide with such force, the result is never a quiet transition. It is a seismic shift. The tension is palpable in the global oil markets, in the movement of carrier strike groups, and in the increased activity of cyber warfare units on both sides. The digital and physical worlds are aligning for a confrontation that neither side can afford to lose. As the rhetoric intensifies, the role of the protesters becomes the ultimate wild card. They are the focal point of the American strategy and the primary threat to the Iranian establishment. By supporting them, the United States is effectively intervening in the internal soul of the nation. By branding this support as criminal, Khamenei is attempting to delegitimize the very concept of dissent. This creates a lethal environment for anyone caught in the middle. The internal security apparatus of Iran is now operating under the belief that they are not fighting their own people, but an extension of an American criminal enterprise. This mindset justifies a level of force that could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe far beyond what we have already seen. The global order is currently holding its breath. The language being used by both Khamenei and Trump has removed the safety catch from the weapon of statecraft. We are no longer talking about if there will be a confrontation, but what form it will take. Will it be a slow, agonizing economic strangulation that leads to an internal implosion? Or will the verbal escalation trigger a kinetic response, a sudden, violent flashpoint in the Strait of Hormuz or across the borders of a proxy state? The intelligence suggests that the threshold for a major event has been crossed. The branding of a leader as a criminal is often the final step before the formal declaration of hostilities. We must understand that this is not just about 2 men or 2 governments. This is about the fundamental clash between 2 irreconcilable visions of the future. One vision sees a Middle East integrated into a Western-led global economy, free from the 1979 revolutionary framework. The other sees a region defined by its resistance to that very system, led by a guardianship that has survived against all odds for 40 years. This moment is the climax of that struggle. The fatal mistake may have already been made, the mistake of assuming the other side will blink first. In a duel of this magnitude, blinking is not an option, and the only thing more dangerous than a powerful enemy is an enemy who feels they have nothing left to lose. The silence that follows such heavy accusations is the most terrifying part. It is the silence of preparation. The world is not just watching a news cycle. It is watching the dismantling of an era. The consequences of these words will be felt for decades, regardless of who remains standing when the dust settles. This is the precipice. The bridge between the past and the future has been burned, and the actors are now standing on opposite sides of a widening canyon. As the supreme leader doubles down on his accusations, and the American leadership intensifies its call for a new era, the geopolitical map is being redrawn in real time. What happens next will not be a return to the old ways. It will be the birth of a new, and likely much more violent, reality. The transition is no longer a possibility. It is an inevitability. The only question that remains is how much of the old world will be consumed by the fire as the new one struggles to be born. The shift we are witnessing is not contained within the borders of a single nation. It is a fracture in the very foundation of the global order. When the structural integrity of a major regional power like Iran is called into question, the vibrations are felt in every stock exchange, every military command center, and every energy hub on the planet. We must look beyond the immediate headlines of protest and rhetoric to understand the systemic contagion that follows. If the 40-year reign of the current establishment were to collapse or even radically pivot, the resulting power vacuum would not be filled by peace. It would be filled by a chaos so profound it would redefine the 21st century. This is the power vacuum paradox. The very thing the West calls for might be the catalyst for a global catastrophe that no one is prepared to manage. Consider the regional architecture that has been built over the last 4 decades. from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Afghanistan. A complex web of influence, militias, and political alliances has been meticulously woven. This is often referred to in intelligence circles as a security architecture that, however hostile, provides a form of predictable stability. If the center of this web in Tehran were to vanish overnight, the entire Levant would enter a state of freefall. We are talking about the immediate destabilization of Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. This would not be a localized transition. It would be a multinational proxy war on a scale never before seen in modern history. The sudden removal of a central authority creates a black hole effect, drawing in neighboring powers, Turkey, Israel, and the Gulf monarchies, each forced to intervene to protect their own borders. The result is a regional wildfire that cannot be extinguished by traditional diplomacy. But the contagion spreads much further than the Middle East. We are now entering the era of the Great Realignment. For years, the global balance of power has relied on a certain level of predictability in the energy markets and maritime corridors. This predictability is now being liquidated. At the heart of this tension lies the world's most critical economic kill switch, the Strait of Hormuz. Through this narrow choke point flows nearly 20% of the world's total petroleum liquids. The intelligence is clear. Any perceived existential threat to the Iranian state is a direct threat to this waterway. If the rhetoric of criminality and end of reign transitions into kinetic action, the global economy faces a cardiac arrest. A closure of this strait, even for a few days, would send oil prices into a vertical spike, triggering a wave of hyperinflation that would destabilize Western economies more effectively than any conventional weapon. The market does not care about ideology. It cares about certainty, and certainty is currently the world's most depleted resource. This brings us to the intervention of the other global titans. Moscow and Beijing are not passive observers in this duel. For Russia, a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran is a strategic opportunity and a profound risk. A distracted America is an advantage in the European theater, but a total collapse of the Iranian state would remove a key partner in the Eurasian heartland. China, on the other hand, views this through the lens of energy security and long-term infrastructure. As the world's largest importer of crude oil, China cannot allow the Middle East to descend into a permanent state of anarchy. If Washington pushes for a total reset of the Iranian system, it is effectively forcing Beijing and Moscow to abandon their neutrality. We are seeing the early stages of a formal Eurasian bloc, a military and economic alliance designed specifically to counterbalance American pressure. This turns a bilateral feud into a structural shift in the global balance of power, effectively ending the era of unipolar American dominance. The hidden consequence of this moment is the death of the international legal framework. When a supreme leader and a president exchange such terminal accusations, the concept of international law becomes a relic of the past. We are returning to a world of raw power, where might dictates the new normal. This creates a dangerous precedent for other regional powers. If the 40-year-old Iranian status quo can be targeted for total dissolution, then no border and no regime is safe. This realization is currently rippling through the corridors of power in secondary nations, leading to a global surge in militarization. Nations are no longer investing in diplomacy. They are investing in the hardware of survival. The arms race we are seeing now is not about prestige. It is a desperate attempt to build enough leverage to avoid becoming the next target of a global reset. The economic trigger is already being pulled. Beyond oil, we are seeing the weaponization of the global financial system. The use of sanctions as a tool of regime change has reached its logical limit. As Washington uses the dollar to squeeze Tehran, it is inadvertently teaching the rest of the world how to live without the dollar. We are witnessing the birth of parallel economies, financial systems that operate outside the reach of Western oversight. This is perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the current confrontation. Even if the Iranian regime survives, the damage to the global financial order is irreversible. The world is splitting into two distinct economic zones, and the friction between these two zones will be the primary source of conflict for the next generation. As we look toward the immediate future, the tension is reaching a climax that cannot be sustained. The fatal mistake, of the major powers may be the belief that they can control the outcome of this escalation. History teaches us that once a system enters a state of high-entropy chaos, it follows its own logic. The protesters in the streets, the soldiers at the borders, and the traders in the energy markets are all part of a single, interconnected machine that is currently vibrating at a frequency it was never designed to handle. We are not just talking about the end of a reign. We are talking about the end of an era of managed conflict. The uncertainty is now the only constant. Whether it is a sudden maritime incident, a cyberstrike that cripples a national grid, or a miscalculated move by a regional proxy, the tripwire is active. The world is standing on the edge of a new reality, one where the old rules have been discarded and the new ones have yet to be written. The consequence of the current rhetoric is that there is no longer a path back to the world as it was yesterday. The only path is forward, into a landscape defined by volatility, realignment, and the high probability of a systemic shock that will spare no nation. The global order is being rewritten in the shadow of this confrontation, and the ink being used is the stability we once took for granted. The question is no longer who will win this duel, but what will be left of the international system when the duel is over. The silence we hear now is not the absence of conflict. It is the deep, heavy breath before the storm breaks.